The airport buzzed with the usual chaos, rolling suitcases, blaring announcements, and the impatient tapping of passengers. But inside Terminal B, something far more tense was unfolding. Captain Naomi Carter adjusted her aviator sunglasses, her sharp eyes scanning the pre-flight checklist one last time. She had flown through sandstorms and emergency landings, but today's battle wouldn't be against the weather. It would be against something far more insidious. As she approached the cockpit of Flight 227, a firm hand blocked her path. "Sorry, ma'am," Greg Harris said, his voice dripping with false politeness. "Only authorized personnel beyond this point." Naomi's grip tightened on her badge. "I am authorized," she said coolly. "I'm your captain today." Greg's lips curled into a smirk. "We've had security concerns, new protocol." Behind him, co-pilot Mark Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. Naomi's pulse pounded in her ears. She knew this game. The delays, the mistakes with her schedule, the way certain crew members suddenly forgot her rank. But this was bold. "Greg," she said, her voice low and steady, "you have 5 seconds to move." Passengers nearby had stopped boarding, sensing the tension. A little girl tugged her mother's sleeve. "Why won't they let the lady fly?" The mother hushed her, but the damage was done. All eyes were on them now. Greg crossed his arms. "Look, Naomi." "Captain Carter," she corrected, his jaw twitched. "Fine, Captain, the airline has the right to reassign crews for safety reasons." The unspoken words hung heavy in the air. "And we don't trust you." Naomi's phone buzzed, a notification from the FAA. She didn't glance at it. Instead, she took a slow step forward, her voice cutting through the terminal's noise. "Move, or I'll make sure you never work in aviation again." Silence, even the boarding announcement seemed to pause. Greg's smirk faltered. He hadn't expected her to fight back, and he had no idea what was coming next. Murmur rippled through the crowd as Naomi stood her ground, the weight of every stare pressing against her skin. Greg's face flushed red, his carefully constructed authority cracking under her defiance. "You're making a scene," he hissed, eyes darting toward the gathering passengers. Naomi didn't blink. "No," she said, voice sharp as steel. "You did the moment you decided I wasn't fit to fly my own plane." Nearby, an elderly woman, Margaret, leaned forward in her seat, her wrinkled hands gripping the armrests. "Let the woman do her job," she called out, her tone brooking no argument. Mark, the co-pilot, finally stepped forward, his voice strained. "Greg, maybe we should just stay out of this," Greg snapped, cutting him off. A businessman in a tailored suit, Daniel, snorted from the boarding line. "They've got rules for a reason," he muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. "Some people just can't take a hint." Naomi's jaw tightened, but she refused to rise to the bait. Instead, she turned to the flight attendants who hovered nervously nearby. "Get the passengers seated," she ordered. "This flight will depart on time." Greg's laugh was bitter. "Not with you in charge." He pulled out his radio, thumb hovering over the call button. "Last chance, Captain, walk away or security drags you out." The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Naomi could feel the seconds ticking by, the delay costing the airline thousands, but Greg didn't care. This wasn't about protocol, it was about power, and he was willing to burn everything down to keep hers in check. And from the back of the cabin, a child's voice piped up. "Daddy, why?" That man being mean to the pilot. The question, innocent and piercing, seemed to freeze the entire terminal. Even Daniel stiffened, his smug facade flickering. Greg's hand wavered on the radio. Naomi didn't wait for his next move. She reached into her blazer and pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. "You want to play it this way?" she said, her voice eerily calm. "Fine, but remember, you asked for it." The cabin lights flickered overhead as the first shout came from the tarmac. A pair of uniformed officers stormed through the jet bridge, their badges glinting under the fluorescence. Greg's confidence faltered. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, but the officers ignored him, stopping squarely in front of Naomi. One of them nodded. "Ma'am," he said, respectful, "we got your signal." And just like that, the balance of power shattered. Greg's mouth went slack as the officers snapped to attention beside Naomi. The radio slipped from his fingers, clattering against the jet bridge floor. "Ma'am," he repeated, voice cracking on the word. Naomi didn't smile. She simply reached into her inner pocket and produced a second badge, one that made Mark gasp and sent Greg stumbling back a step. The gold FAA seal caught the fluorescent light as she held it up for all to see. "Special Agent Carter," she said, her military precision cutting through the murmurs. "Federal Aviation Administration, Office of Investigations." The elderly passenger Margaret actually clapped, her rings clicking together like a verdict. Daniel, the businessman, turned a sickly shade of pale as he fumbled for his phone, whether to record or call a lawyer. Even he didn't seem to know. Naomi kept her eyes locked on Greg, whose throat worked soundlessly. "You've been under investigation for 6 months," she continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the gate area. "Falsified maintenance logs, discrimination complaints buried in paperwork. And now," she gestured to the still-open cockpit door, "attempted interference with a federal safety inspection." Mark backed away from Greg like he was contagious. "You told me she was just some diversity hire?" The words burst out of him, raw with betrayal. Naomi didn't flinch. She'd heard it all before, the whispers in crew lounges, the compliments about how articulate she was for a black woman. But today the whispers would stop. Today they'd all hear her roar. Senior officer stepped forward, hand resting on his duty belt. Mr. Harris, you're to surrender all airline credentials immediately. When Greg didn't move, the officer added, the FAA has already suspended this carrier's operating license pending full audit. A collective gasp rose from the passengers. Someone's phone camera flashed. Naomi saw the exact moment Greg realized this wasn't just about one flight. This was about to become national news. Margaret stood suddenly, her cane thumping against the floor. I knew it, she crowed, pointing at Greg with a trembling finger. That weasel look about him. The tension broke as laughter rippled through the crowd. Even the stone-faced officers cracked smiles. But Naomi remained focused, watching as Greg's arrogance finally crumbled into something far more satisfying. Fear. Real, visceral fear of consequences he'd spent a career avoiding. And came the sound no one expected: applause. Starting with the flight attendants, spreading to passengers, even a few ground crew peering through the windows. It wasn't just for the takedown, Naomi knew. It was for every time they'd seen something wrong and stayed silent. Every microaggression swallowed. Every injustice tolerated for the sake of keeping the peace. Today, the peace had been shattered, and the echoes would be heard in boardrooms across the industry. Greg finally found his voice. You can't prove anything, he spat, but the tremor in his hands betrayed him. Naomi simply tilted her head toward the cockpit. You mean besides the recording devices we installed last week? The blood drained from his face. Or the paper trail even your connections can't bury this time? She took a single step forward, and to his shame, Greg flinched. You picked the wrong pilot to bully, she said softly. Then louder, for the cameras now trained on them. And the FAA is done looking the other way. The terminal erupted. Hush fell over the gate area as the officers escorted Greg away, his once crisp uniform shirt now wrinkled with sweat. Naomi watched just long enough to see his shoulders slump in defeat before turning to the stunned crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced, her pilot's voice cutting through the murmurs, Flight 227 is officially grounded pending investigation. The groans started instantly: missed connections, important meetings, family emergencies, but Naomi held up a hand. Every passenger will be rebooked on alternate flights with priority status, and, she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, complimentary first-class upgrades for your inconvenience. Mood shifted instantly. A young mother near the front actually cheered, bouncing her toddler on her hip. Daniel, the businessman who'd sneered earlier, suddenly found his voice. Agent Carter, he called out, scrambling to adjust his tie, if I could have a word about possibly testifying. Naomi cut him off with a look that had made junior pilots cry. Save it for the congressional hearing, she said dryly. Margaret's cackle of laughter echoed through the terminal. Behind her, Mark stood frozen near the cockpit door, his face a mask of horror. I didn't know, he blurted out when Naomi turned to him. About any of it, I swear. She studied him, the nervous tick in his left eye, the way his fingers worried at his wedding band. Liars usually met her gaze too boldly or not at all. Mark just looked like a man realizing he'd been a pawn in someone else's crooked game. You're not fired, Naomi said at last, watching his shoulders sag in relief. But you are grounded until you complete sensitivity training, and, she leaned in slightly, you'll be personally auditing every diversity complaint filed with this airline for the past 5 years. Gate agent's printer suddenly whirred to life, spitting out rebooking documents as airline executives materialized like ghosts, their expensive suits failing to hide their panic. One particularly pale man in a $3,000 tie rushed forward. Agent Carter, surely we can discuss this. Naomi silenced him with a glance at his name tag. Mr. Whitmore, funny, your signature appears on 3 of the buried complaints. His mouth snapped shut so fast his teeth clicked. Through the terminal windows, Naomi could see the ground crew scrambling to unload luggage from the now grounded plane. A news van had already pulled up on the tarmac, its satellite dish unfolding like some mechanical vulture. This would be headlines by noon, boardroom panic by cocktail hour. Exactly as she'd planned when she'd taken this undercover assignment 6 months ago. Margaret appeared at her elbow suddenly, thrusting a napkin and pen into Naomi's hands. Autograph, the old woman demanded. When Naomi laughed, Margaret's eyes twinkled. Honey, I marched with Dr. King, today. She gestured at the chaos around them, the arrested executives, the filming passengers, the airline staff whispering behind their hands. This is what progress looks like. Naomi signed the napkin with a flourish, then handed it back just as her phone buzzed. The text from her supervisor read simply, Good work, White House wants briefing. She allowed herself one deep breath, the adrenaline finally ebbing. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but today had been a damn good start. News vans multiplied like ants at a picnic, their satellite dishes tilting toward the terminal as reporters shouted questions through the glass. Naomi watched the circus unfold from the relative quiet of an airline office, sipping terrible coffee from a styrofoam cup. Her phone had been vibrating nonstop media requests, old colleagues suddenly remembering they had her number, even a tentative outreach from the Airline Pilots Association about a speaking engagement. The door creaked open and Mark hovered awkwardly in the threshold, clutching 2 file boxes overflowing with paperwork. First batch of complaints, he said, voice hoarse. There's more. Naomi set down her coffee. Good, a beat passed. Mark shifted his weight, then blurted out, "I looked up your service record. 2 distinguished flying crosses. Saved 148 souls when that 747 lost engines over the Pacific." His throat worked. "And Greg had you pegged as some?" "Some." "Token," Naomi supplied dryly. The word didn't sting anymore, not when the man who'd spat it was currently being perp-walked across every news network. Outside, a cheer went up as Margaret gave an impromptu press conference near the Starbucks, her cane waving like a royal scepter. Mark set the boxes down with a thud. "I'm sorry." Simple, unadorned, the first real thing he'd said to her. Naomi studied him, the sweat-stained collar, the red-rimmed eyes. Maybe he'd be one of the ones who actually learned, maybe not, that wasn't her burden to carry. "Start with the 2019 cases," she said, tapping the top file. "The Nguyen deposition will show the pattern." Her phone buzzed again, her supervisor, this time with a flight number. "Marine 1 transport secured. POTUS wants details before the presser." Naomi allowed herself a small, tired smile. 6 months of meticulous undercover work of biting her tongue through 100 microaggressions, all culminating in this moment. She stood, straightening her blazer. The badge at her hip caught the light. At the door she paused. The terminal was chaos, crying bobbies, flashing cameras, a gospel singer who'd somehow commandeered the PA system to belt out, "A change is gonna come." But through the madness, Naomi saw the little girl from earlier, the one who'd asked why the mean man wouldn't let the lady fly. She was perched on her father's shoulders now, waving a toy airplane with one hand and a hastily made sign with the other. Captain Carter is MY hero in glittery purple crayon. Naomi's breath caught. This was why she'd endured the whispers, the doubt, the endless proving and reproving of her worth, not for the headlines or the coming political firestorm, but for the little girls who'd never again question whether they belonged in the cockpit. She adjusted her sunglasses and stepped into the light. The camera lingers on the empty pilot's seat in the grounded aircraft, sunlight glinting off the controls that nearly went untouched. Then, with a smooth transition, we pull back to reveal Naomi's silhouette in the terminal window, a quiet figure amid the swirling chaos, her reflection superimposed over the news crews and cheering passengers. "Some people say justice moves slowly," the narrator's voice murmurs, rich with quiet intensity. "But sometimes it arrives right on schedule." The scene dissolves into real news footage, Greg being led away in handcuffs, board members resigning, the airline stock price plummeting in real time. Clips play of Naomi testifying before Congress, her voice steady as she holds up blacked-out documents. The truth doesn't disappear just because someone tries to bury it. We cut to a montage of reactions. The little girl from the terminal now wearing pilot wings at a Bring Your Daughter to Work day. Margaret being interviewed on morning television, wagging her finger at the camera. Mark noticeably humbler, helping load complaint boxes into an official government van. The music swells as we return to Naomi, now in full dress uniform, walking through an aircraft hangar filled with young aviation students. Minority kids, mostly. Their eyes widen as she passes. One reaches out to touch her sleeve like she's a superhero. "Every time someone says you don't belong here," the narrator continues, "they're not just attacking one person, they're attacking every dream that hasn't been born yet." The camera pushes in on Naomi kneeling to tie a little girl's shoelace, the child's future pilot, t-shirt wrinkled but proud. Then a sudden shift, the screen goes black, silence. "Now it's your turn,"